Hello, everybody, and welcome to Narrative. In Gaza, Israeli forces appear ready to lay siege to Gaza City after days of an unrelenting ground offensive in response to the Hamas attacks on Israel on October the 7th. Hundreds of Hamas militants have been killed, and 19 Israeli soldiers have also died. 240 hostages remain in captivity. But those numbers belie the real situation on the ground in Gaza, which has been described as catastrophic. Foreigners trapped in Gaza have been allowed to leave through the Rafah border with Egypt. President Biden is calling for a humanitarian pause and has dispatched Secretary of State Anthony Blinken back to the Middle East with one mission in mind: to protect civilians. There are also reports this evening that the Biden administration is looking beyond Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to help solve the crisis. My guest tonight is one of Israel's leading political commentators. She joins me for a remarkable conversation that is both personal and political. We're joined now by Tal Shalev from one of the biggest news outlets in Israel. Tal is the chief political correspondent for Walla News, the largest Israeli website providing independent breaking news and analysis 24 hours a day. She covers Israel Prime Minister, government and parliament, as well as the country's foreign and diplomatic affairs. And even though we share a last name, we're not related, but it's great to have you on the show. Welcome to Narrative, Tal.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
It's been quite a remarkable turnaround, it feels to me, in the last couple of weeks. We've had I guess there was a little bit of hope for negotiations and peace a few weeks ago. And now this unrelenting assault on Gaza, which seems to be, the pictures seem awful on both sides. It's just the area where the Israelis are fighting seems like a war zone out of Mars. And it seems so destitute and destroyed. And then also for the civilians stuck in Gaza, it's just a hopeless situation for everybody. What's the latest from where you are in Tel Aviv? What's the vantage point like from there where you are?
I think, first of all, it's important to describe and note what kind of state of mind Israel is in right now, the Israeli people, because the 7th of October massacre was like nothing we have ever experienced or ever imagined. And honestly, it's been like a nightmare ever since, because every day we hear more stories of the horror that happened there and really unhuman atrocities, really undescribable crimes against really peaceful civilians. You should know that the Gaza Strip, the communities on the Gaza border at large, they are probably one of the last peace proponents in Israel. So the shock and the grief and the fear and the anxiety is still very much vivid in our day-to-day life. Even though the fighting is going on in Gaza, there are about 200,000 Israelis who have been evacuated, both from the Gaza Strip and from the north, where there's another front. At large, the feeling in Israel, on the one hand, is very fragile, perhaps even insecure. And on the other hand, there has been a ground incursion going on almost a week of the IDF in Gaza, which also has already taken more lives of soldiers who fell in battle. I think we're at 19 at the moment since the ground incursion started last week. And yes, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is deteriorating. There's a lot of international pressure on Israel to open up humanitarian corridors. But if I go back to where I started, I don't think the Israeli public is yet willing or is that open to open humanitarian corridors without it having any humanitarian response to our 242 hostages currently kept in Gaza. And it's important to note that many of those hostages are not prisoners of war. They're not soldiers that were captured. They are civilian hostages, children and women and young girls, all taken hostage by Hamas. And Hamas, in many ways, is keeping both Israel captured and the Gaza population, the Gaza civilian population captured, because Israel has been urging the residents of Gaza to move down, to evacuate from Gaza to a safe strip in the south of the Gaza Strip. And Hamas reportedly has not been letting the civilians out. And Hamas is still operating under hospitals and in between civilian households. It's a very complicated situation, and it's a very tragic situation.
It isn't. I mean, there's so much there that it's so important to pick up on. And the first part, I think, was that Israelis are still experiencing the trauma and recovering from the trauma of what happened on October 7th. It'll take them many years to probably do that. But reliving those images as they've been reported in the news has been re-traumatizing the Israeli population again. So you've got a sort of a secondary reaction to what happened on October 7th. And that's causing new emotions and new tensions to flare up. And it's certainly, the intention there is obviously exactly what Hamas intended, was for there to be something so bloody and gruesome that it would enrage Israelis to the point that they would do exactly what they're doing now. And that's the awful part of this whole situation, is basically Hamas laid a trap, and regardless of how you react, you're falling into that trap unless they release the hostages, which is now, in the last few hours, we've had Hamas again say to NBC News here locally that they are willing to release all the hostages if there's a cessation of military activity and if there's a release of all the Palestinian prisoners. Now, that's a bit of a ruse, of course. It can't be done. But if it couldn't be done, is that something that would be popular in Israel? Are people actively interested in this prisoner swap for the hostages?
Like everything in the region and in this country, it's complicated. First of all, I would take everything that Hamas says with a grain of salt, as they are employing deep psychological warfare on Israelis, especially on that matter of the hostages, which is basically really tearing up every person in the country's heart. There are families, again, all the families and the children and the elderly, and it's just, and I cover the families, I speak to the families, and you just cannot bear the pain of this. The families themselves have brought up the notion of a prisoner swap, and they have presented an equation, even a very, I would say, grandiose equation, which says, let's release all of Hamas prisoners in Israeli prisons, which is about 6,000, in exchange for the 242 hostages in Gaza. Now, the Israeli psyche and collective trauma does not like prisoner swaps. The last time we did a prisoner swap was with Hamas in 2011, in which Israel released over, I think, 1,200 Hamas terrorists, not Hamas, Palestinian, not only Hamas, Palestinian terrorists from the Israeli prisons in exchange for one soldier. Now, many of the terrorists that were released in that prisoner swap, they were highly involved in the horrible massacre that happened on October 7th. I think that it'll be very difficult politically and publicly to create public support for such a grandiose deal. That being said, I also, up until now, Hamas did not even bring up that deal. There has been behind the scenes mediation. Qatar is mediating between Israel. The US is involved. Many European countries are involved. But so far, there hasn't been a real offer on the table. So I just think that the only thing I can say is that I do not envy the decision makers in Israel who will have to make that decision if such a deal does emerge. Personally, I think that our first duty is to bring all of those hostages home. But the general Israeli atmosphere and public opinion does not necessarily agree with me. Would probably be very divisive, the question, if such a deal was to come up. And I'm not sure how Benjamin Netanyahu, as prime minister, whose main coalition is a very right-wing coalition, who will probably be opposed to such a deal, it'll probably take a very heavy political price from Netanyahu, which I don't know if he's willing to take.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Mr. Prime Minister Netanyahu, because you pointed out in an article published recently that he has not yet taken any responsibility for the events, not necessarily of October the 7th, but certainly the security situation leading up to October 7th and the unpreparedness of the Israeli military forces and the intelligence forces for this attack. There's other people who have taken responsibility within the infrastructure there, but not Bibi Netanyahu. Even the same person who offered that hostage exchange today on NBC News, even he was saying this war didn't start on October 7th. This war started many years ago. There's a lot of people who are accepting that there are different areas of responsibility, but Bibi Netanyahu seems to have been quite stalwart in this. He's not taking any responsibility. He's barely even appeared in public, and where he has, it's been very staged managed. What are we to take from that? Is he just determined to see this until the very end?
I think that, first of all, historically, Netanyahu is not a big responsibility taker. If we look back at his history, which is he's the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, then he doesn't really tend to take responsibility for any failure. He's very good at taking credit for the successes, but not necessarily for the failures. And just to point out, in May 2021, there was a very big civilian disaster in a religious gathering in which there was a huge collapse and 45 people were killed. And Netanyahu, who was prime minister at the time, and this is the biggest civilian disaster in Israel's history, he said, I didn't know, I can't be responsible because I didn't know about the things. So he's going to try and use the same strategy. He's trying to use the same strategy to put all of the responsibility for the failures and for the misdoings, especially for the collapse of the intelligence, to put it on the army and the top security brass. And to be honest, their failure is very big. It's clear that anyone from the head of intelligence and the IDF and upwards will probably resign at the end of the war. The Israeli security establishment has a